Okay, if you know somebody who's experienced the horror of sleep paralysis, you need to tag or share this video with them. Every year, up to 8% of the population will experience the horrific phenomenon of sleep paralysis. You awaken realizing that your body is unable to move, leaving you in the halfway point between sleep and awake. This is often accompanied by a series of disturbing hallucinations referred to as sleep paralysis demons. People often report the feelings of pressure or suffocation, or the sensation of being dragged out of their bed, or even sensing the presence of someone else in the room. Psychologists have often debated the mystery behind this experience and have very little long-term knowledge to determine what causes it. To work your way out of paralysis, it's suggested that you get a grip on your breath and reality and focus on small movements if possible. Although you are always safe during the experience, the direct stare into something standing in your room is often too terrifying to put into words. Warning, this is a story that will contain imagery that some people will find to be distressing. This is the horrifically dark history of the freak show. Freak shows were a performative convention that actually dates all the way back to the Middle Ages, but then they were revamped in the era of circus as traveling sideshows in the early 1800s. Sideshows typically made profit off the marvel of those who had extraordinary abilities or appearances, whereas freak shows specifically were exploiting and profiting off those who were born with physical disabilities or abnormalities, as the rest of society would reject them. But there was one act in particular that stood out: Grady Stiles. Grady was born with a rare condition known as ectrodactyly, which fused his fingers and toes and left him unable to walk. You would probably recognize his character, which was adapted and made very sexy by Evan Peters in American Horror Story. But the real-life story of Grady is so much darker. Because he was unable to walk, he had developed almost unnatural upper body strength, and that mixed with a short temper and a history of alcoholism, he became abusive and dangerous. In 1978, Grady shot and killed his eldest daughter's fiance on the eve of her wedding, but due to his disability, he was sent to house arrest over prison, where his abuse continued. By 1992, his wife had had enough and somehow convinced a 17-year-old who was a sideshow performer to conspire to kill Grady. Following his death, they were both caught and sentenced, leaving the story of the great Grady Stiles just as grim as when it started. What could be more terrifying than the thought of your own body setting itself on fire? For hundreds of years, this phenomenon has been the subject of scientific scrutiny as well as deep mystery: spontaneous human combustion. This is when the human body appears to ignite internally, a fire starting from within before the entire body becomes engulfed. This actually dates all the way back to the 1600s, and since then there have only ever been about 200 cases reported worldwide. In 1984, a scientific team was assembled led by Joe Nickell to investigate a number of these cases dating back to the 1800s. One of the unusual threads that was found between all of these cases was that with every body investigated, there seemed to be some trace of alcohol in the system. This gave way to the Wick theory, suggesting that if alcohol was in the system and there was some kind of a chemical change that could ignite a fire, body fat could be used as an accelerant, making the mystery of this phenomenon one you should think about next time you're drinking. Here are 3 pictures with something dark lurking in the background. And if you're loving Creep Time and you want longer content, make sure to subscribe to my YouTube channel with the link in the bio. Number 1. With what kind of just looks like an overpacked truck at first, if you look a little bit closer, you might be horrified to find a small child in the back. Caught by a passing driver, all that can be seen is the head of a small boy crammed beneath the dresser. Number 2. When a wife had her camera roll developed, she thought she'd see pictures of her husband and her cat on the couch, but what she caught was horrifying: a smiling head beneath the end table. She confirmed in horror there was nothing she saw in that room after taking these pictures, leaving the face seen completely unexplainable. Number 3. During the attacks of 9/11, a picture was captured of what appears to be a woman standing at the impact zone. It's unknown how she could have survived the impact or what appears to be her leaning up against scorching steel, making our final photo a mystery. Here are 3 of the most disturbing mugshots on the internet. Also, if you want more creep content, make sure that you follow and you can subscribe to my YouTube with the link in the bio. Number 1. On the evening of 1990, a woman named Marlene Warren opened her front door to find another woman standing there dressed head to toe as a clown. She was holding balloons and roses, so when Marlene went to reach for some, the woman pulled out a weapon, shot, and killed her. This was a cold case for like 27 years until finally being connected to a woman named Sheila, who was the husband's mistress through the late 80s. Clearly, she does not feel bad bad. Number 2. Provided from a Florida correctional facility, the nature of this woman's crimes were unclear, but her photo made an impact. Distressed hair with these wild eyes, it's very unsettling to stare at this shot for even more than a few seconds. Number 3. Coming in from Lakeport, Texas, this was a suspect who was apprehended following a break-in. When taken into custody, the station was kind of shocked as there's something very off about his features. Something unexplainable. Let me explain to you why this is a doll that you have to give verbal consent to see in person. You're also maybe wondering why her eyes are blocked out in these pictures. The doll was acquired by multiple curators over the last couple of decades, but it's unknown who the original owner was. What we do know is that the doll was sent away from its previous owner, and they claimed it to be the cause of severe hallucinations and said that it was moving on its own. Over the years, the doll has been subject to both historical and paranormal investigation, and there have been at least 80 documented cases of different spectators looking into its eyes and claiming experiences of nausea, headaches, chest pain, even lightheadedness. I've actually seen this doll in person in Nevada, and you do have to give consent before you go into the room. It's optional to look into her eyes, but they recommend that if you do, you greet her with hello and then finish with goodbye as a way of closure to the encounter. I am going to show you a photo without her eyes blocked, so feel free to stay, or you can scroll. On February 19th of 1994, 31-year-old Gloria Ramirez was rushed to a California emergency room. She was reportedly severely confused and experiencing heart palpitations, but the medical staff noticed something was wrong here. Her skin had a sheen to it like it was slicked with oil, and her mouth had an odor of fruit and garlic. They also noticed that when they drew her blood, it reeked of ammonia and had crystal-like particles in it. But then the unusual happened. One by one, the medical staff began to pass out around her. In total, there were 23 people who fell ill, so the ER was completely evacuated as it was believed for an unknown reason her body was toxic. Following her death shortly after, examiners autopsied her in hazmat suits but were perplexed to find virtually nothing unusual in her system. There were unusually high levels of dimethylsulfone, but it's unclear what that may have contributed here. Although mostly attributed to mass hysteria, many believe there was something with her body that caused this. In 2014, 2 college students, one named Chris Kremers and the other Lisanne Froon, traveled to Panama. They were going to be put up by a host family and just do some volunteer teaching. About 2 weeks into their trip, they decided to go on a morning hike in the El Pianista rainforest, but never made it back. There is a massive search for these girls. The parents fly in, they hire investigators, but there is no trace of them for more than 2 months. That is until one of their backpacks was discovered near a riverbank 5 miles away. But not only was it completely dry, it was in perfect condition, almost like it was placed there. Not too long after, portions of the remains were found nearby, but only fragments of bones. Strangely, it was found that one of the feet of the girls had been cut off clean, right within the shoe, and there was evidence to support that they did not die at the same time. But what really chilled investigators was the analysis of the phones and the camera within the backpack. Data on their phones showed that over the course of 11 days in that rainforest, they had made 77 attempts to call for help. A probe into the digital camera showed that there were a series of 90 photos that were taken on the night of April 8th. This was 8 days after they went missing. The photos are they're kind of aimless. They're just kind of nonsensical, just of random landmarks and the rain at night. And then there was this photo, just of Chris Kremers' hair, and it's unknown if she was even alive in the picture. The mystery of their deaths is hauntingly unexplained, and what they really experienced in those 11 days, we may never actually know. Welcome to Creep Time on TikTok with Silas Dean. I really wanted to do this murder first because it's so creepy. This is the unexplained murder of room 1046. On January 2nd of 1935, a man who was going by the name of Roland T. Owen checked into the Hotel President in Kansas City, Missouri. While staying in the hotel, there were multiple accounts of housekeeping finding him in the room, sitting upright on the bed, fully awake, fully dressed, and sitting in almost complete darkness alone. There was also a confirmed account of a maid coming into the room when he was not there and finding a note by the bed that read, "Don, I will be back in 15 minutes, wait." There were actually several accounts of housekeeping hearing a couple of voices in the room, particularly the voice of a man who was not checked in and who was not this person. On January 4th, a bellhop enters the room, which had been locked from the outside, and finds Roland on the floor covered in blood. He had been beaten and stabbed, but was still alive. Police were called to the scene and questioned him while he was still alive and asked him who had done this to him, and he said no one. He had just hit his head on the tub. Roland would die in the hospital several hours later without confirming any suspects. As police are looking for leads, they realized the name that he had given to the hotel was not his name. Police ended up running his sketch in the papers, but nobody was able to come forward to adequately identify him at the time. After about a year and a half from the murder, a woman comes forward from Alabama named Ruby Ogletree, who was able to identify this as her son, Artemis, who had been hitchhiking to California and left home at the age of 17. Unfortunately, till this day, there are still large parts of this case that are wide open and may never be solved, but that is the murder of room 1046. This is part 2 of the Tamla Horsford case. Jose, the homeowner's boyfriend, would actually be fired as a pretrial officer down the line for trying to illegally obtain internal details about Tamla's case file. Investigators lead with a theory that she was just so intoxicated she fell right off the 4-foot banister, but neither a second toxicology report nor videos taken that night show her anywhere near that drunk. Looking at the circumstantial evidence here, it just doesn't add up. She's found with a severely broken wrist, one that hit a major artery that would have pooled blood under the body. Although when her body is found, there is no blood found under her wrist or her body. The factor of race has played a huge part in this case. Immediately suspects that Tamla was the only woman of color who was invited to this party. Witness testimonies report derogatory comments and jokes that were made at Tamla that very night. One woman calling her Bob Marley, and then the aunt who discovered her referring to her as the woman from the islands. More troubling than that, this is a picture of Chris Shelton, who was the deputy coroner on the scene who determined the manner of death. Not to mention, this is already taking place in a part of Georgia where there is a painful history of racism. One of the last pieces of overwhelming evidence is a deleted Facebook post from the woman who hosted this party. There are no public screenshots of this Facebook post, but it was provided by a friend to CBS 46 and then confirmed from a statement from her attorney saying she misspoke. In her post, she writes, and I quote, "There was no fall from my deck." The post was deleted shortly after. We can't continue to give the benefit of the doubt when there is just so much evidence. Something happened here that we don't fully know. Welcome to Creep Time on TikTok with Silas Dean. This is a case that is bone-chilling to me, and I remember the first time that I heard it too. This is the unsolved mystery of the Lady of the Dunes. On July 26th of 1974, a 12-year-old girl stumbles upon a woman laying face down on a beach blanket in the dunes of Provincetown, Massachusetts. As she gets a bit closer, she realizes what she's looking at is the body of a corpse. This woman had been laying there in the dunes for up to 3 weeks. She was found almost decapitated, her hands cut off, and a severe head wound that likely came from somebody who was laying there next to her in the sand. She was also found with a blue bandana and a pair of blue jeans that were under her head at the time that she died. And despite this massive public search effort to try to identify her, no one is ever able to come forward to accurately identify the Lady of the Dunes. The body has been exhumed multiple times trying to scrap her new evidence, make more modern composites of her face, but despite all of that, the case still remains cold. One of the more recent theories is actually a connection to the 70s film Jaws, which had been filming that exact summer just about 100 miles away from Provincetown. In the film, an extra can be spotted who is wearing the exact same clothing that was found with the Lady of the Dunes. And side by side, she's also a very close match to the modern composite drawing. Despite a ton of public outreach, no one has ever come forward to either claim themselves to be or identify this extra. The case remains unsolved and the question still remains, who was the Lady of the Dunes? Welcome to Creep Time on TikTok with Silas Dean. This is just an eerie case. This is the mysterious murder of Blair Adams. Adams was a construction worker living in British Columbia, and a few weeks prior to the events that took place, his friends and family noticed a very stark change in his personality. On July 5th, 1996, he withdraws all of his money from his accounts and leaves for the US unexpectedly. Eventually, he makes his way to Knoxville, Tennessee in this rental car. The rental car marks one of the first known sightings of Adams once he reaches the US at a gas station. While at the gas station, Adams asks an attendant to help him start his car. The attendant realizes he's using the wrong key and offers to help look. He asks him to check his pockets, which he refuses to do. He instead decides to leave the car at the gas station and just go to a nearby hotel. At around 5:30 p.m., Adams arrives at the Fairfield Inn, where he's seen outside pacing anxiously for almost an hour before he goes inside, gets a room, doesn't take his change, and doesn't go to the room, just leaves. This would also mark the last time Adams was ever seen alive. The following morning, the body of Blair Adams is discovered near a local construction site where he's covered in bruises, scratches, has a severe wound on his head and a fatal wound to his abdomen. The strange part about this case is that all of Adam's belongings were found with his body. All of his cash, his jewels, the missing key to that car, and there was also a long strand of hair that was found in his hand, presumably ripped out from his attacker. Till this day, no one really knows why Adams traveled to Tennessee alone or who's behind the murder. Welcome to Creep Time on TikTok with Silas Dean. This is a case that does not sit right with me. Today we are covering the unsolved death of Matrice Richardson. On September 16th, 2009, 24-year-old Matrice is arrested in Malibu in a very manic state. Her family is contacted and they beg officers to keep her in custody while she's in a state of distress so she's not a danger to herself, which they do not. Around 12:30 in the morning, she is completely released from custody. She is released without any of her belongings and she is completely alone. The last verified sighting would be around 6:30 a.m. that same morning when she's spotted up a hike spanning several miles into Montanito and she's seen in someone's backyard. The police are contacted for the trespassing, but she's gone before anybody even gets there, making this the last moment that she was seen alive. Follow for part 2. Welcome to Creep Time on TikTok with Silas Dean. This is part 2 of the Matrice Richardson case. So after she's spotted in a backyard at 6:30 in the morning, she would never be seen alive again. Matrice goes missing for over 10 months, but she would eventually be found by rangers who spot her in a wooded creek area over 7 miles away from the sheriff's station. Her body is described as completely undressed, partially preserved, and her head is completely severed. Police officers are the first officials to arrive at the scene before anyone else. This is when the case gets unsettling. Police wait over 90 minutes before contacting the coroner to come to the scene. They then delay the coroner from coming for hours. There were also conflicting reports about the state in which the body was found, the location of the severed head, whether or not it was severed. In that time before the coroner gets there, the body is moved, the scene is disrupted, and the remains are completely collected before the coroner even has a chance to inspect the scene, and it's ruled an accidental death. The coroner even goes on to make a statement saying he had never seen a case in which remains were removed without the presence of a coroner. There's also new evidence that comes to light when security footage crops up from the night she was in custody in her cell, which her family was told did not exist. It does show Matrice in her cell in severe distress, but the mystery of her death remains unexplained. Over the years, various investigators have weighed in on the case, and due to the nature of the remains and the handling of the scene, it's not off the table that foul play and or a cover-up might have been involved. Welcome to Creep Time on TikTok with Silas Dean. Today we are covering the disappearance of Maura Murray. Maura is a 21-year-old college student studying nursing in Massachusetts in the year 2004. On February 9th, she sends an email to school letting them know she'll be gone for a week due to a family death, but no one in her family had died. Records that were obtained from her computer would show an earlier search on MapQuest for directions to Burlington, Vermont. At 3:40 p.m. on the same day, she would withdraw all of her money from a local ATM. At around 4 or 5 p.m., she takes off on this trip, having told no one, and just starts traveling up Interstate 91 North. Around 7:27 p.m., Maura's car is crashed on a sharp, snowy turn along Route 112 in New Hampshire, and a neighbor would call the police. Another driver who's returning home also passes her and offers to call for help. She pleads with him not to and insists that she's already called AAA, but phone records would later show that she never called AAA that night. The man carries on home, but decides to call 911 anyway. Between 7:27 and the police arriving at 7:46, Maura is gone. The car is found completely abandoned and she's taken her cell phone and her credit cards, none of which have ever shown a record of being used since that night. That driver would be the last verified sighting of Maura. A witness would later come forward to report seeing a young person dressed in dark clothing traveling very quickly by foot around 8:30 p.m., roughly 4 to 5 miles up Route 112 on the same night. But it was never confirmed if this was Maura. It's been over 17 years since the disappearance, and the case has never been solved. This story is terrifying to me. Welcome to Creep Time on TikTok with Silas Dean. Today we are covering the disappearance of Brandon Lawson. On August 8th, 2013, Brandon Lawson gets into a fight with his girlfriend. She believes he's under the influence, and he leaves at 11:54 p.m. to go to his dad's place. While driving after midnight, Brandon runs out of gas along Route 277 near Bronte, Texas, and he calls his brother for help. He speaks distressingly, claiming that he sees someone on the highway and that he's being followed, but it's unclear whether he might have been hallucinating or or if he actually saw someone. Between 12:50 and 1:15 in the morning, Brandon would make a series of very distressing phone calls, one of which is to 911. For reasons unknown, he would leave his truck and then sprint into the woods off the highway. Officers and his brother arrive by 1:10 and find the truck completely abandoned. His brother then gets a call from Brandon where he's described as panicked and claims that he's bleeding. His brother asks where he is and he replies, "I can see you, I'm right here." But neither police nor his brother can see or hear him anywhere. This is the last known call received from Brandon before he's deemed a missing person. The car is towed by morning and he has never been seen since. But the question still haunts the family. Did Brandon really see someone on the highway that night? And if he did, where did he go? Do not watch this video if you are easily scared. Welcome to Creep Time on TikTok with Silas Dean. Today we are covering a story, I think it was reported in 2019, about the Rocky Mountains of Colorado. The couple that reported this story wished to remain anonymous, so of course I am going to be respectful of that. The story does take place in the Rocky Mountains, which is a really popular location for sightseeing, for hiking. I've driven through there a couple of times. At some point on their hike, they're going way off the trail. They're just basically trekking through the woods. They're not even on a real path anymore. They stumble upon what they describe to be kind of like a small silo. It's basically just a tiny structure that has a door, but nothing else around it. This is pretty brave, but they decide to go explore and open the door. What they find inside is so eerie. They describe it as what sounds like a torture cell. They describe a single chair, they say there are chains in the corner, and they also report seeing a trap door in the floor which they knew they were not going to open. While they're there, they also report possibly hearing footsteps outside of this thing, so they immediately close the door and they head down on the hike as fast as they can. They get back to their car and they just head home. They're freaked out. It's never really clear whether or not they reported this to the police, which is maybe in part why they chose to remain anonymous, but they're still never clear what it is they walked in on. So what do you think this mysterious room is? Here are 3 of the most disturbing facial reconstructions and the chilling backstories behind them. But before we get started, I did make a YouTube channel for everybody who requested. If you want to subscribe, the link is right in the bio. Alright, let's get into it. Number 1. The Irondequoit Jane Doe. Found buried in a shallow grave in New York State, the manner of death was ruled as suspicious, but there were no signs of trauma found on her body. Once found, her remains were so badly decomposed that it's suspected she may have been buried there for up to 30 years before being uncovered. Number 2. The Philadelphia Teen. Discovered to have been shot and possibly burned, his remains were found near the railroad tracks in Philadelphia in 1977, and he was the victim of a horrific homicide. To this day, he has never had any friends or family that have come forward to claim his identity, and he remains unknown. Number 3. The Swimsuit Boy. He is one of the only unidentified bodies to come from the Dean Corll serial killings. Discovered buried beneath the shed, among others, his remains were wearing a multicolored swimsuit, hence the name. And it's not at all that this is a bad reconstruction. It's actually unsettling to me because it's pretty good. When you're looking at it, it's almost like the eyes are looking right back at you. It's that realistic. But what makes it all that more eerie is that it's linked to a missing boy that no one has ever claimed. Do you notice something kind of off about this mannequin? For anyone who's familiar with the legend, she is known as La Pascualita. The mannequin has stood in the window of a Mexican bridal shop for more than 90 years, but when she was first placed there, patrons noticed something kind of strange. The detail work on this mannequin was unusual. She was noted with eyebrow hair, veins, and even discoloration around her mouth and ears. But that suspicion soon grew to horror as patrons started to notice that she bore a striking resemblance to the owner's deceased daughter, Pascuala. Pascuala was actually set to be married herself, but ended up dying in a tragedy before her wedding day. Shortly after her death, the mannequin appeared in the window and the legend was born that these were the preserved remains of the owner's daughter. But the most compelling evidence has always been the hands. The hands are shown with wrinkles, they have veins, they even have lifelike fingernails, which is unlike any mannequin I have ever seen. The question remains to this day, could this really be the shop owner's daughter? Have you ever experienced the fear of a shark attack? I think most people are pretty aware of just how rare that occurrence actually is. But the mysterious case of Michelle Emster is one that bewilders investigators. The morning of April 15th, 1994, her body was discovered washed up on the shore of a San Diego beach. Found completely nude, her body had suffered severe injuries, including a missing leg, broken bones, and unexplained bite marks. The medical examiner rules that this was due to a shark attack, but marine experts come forward to argue the statistical improbability and note that her injuries stories were not consistent with that. It was also noted that prior to her death, Michelle had made several complaints to colleagues of an unknown man she claimed was stalking her, but he was never identified. The night she died, she was reported to have been dropped off at the beach, but it was unknown why she would go there alone or why she would go swimming in such cold waters if she even did. Her clothing was never recovered, but her purse was found placed far from the body. Although it was ruled accidental, the circumstances are still strange. What is it that the rich and elite all have in common? Musicians, world business leaders, even US presidents. They all attend the Bohemian Grove. But before I get into this video, if you want a full-length video on the Bohemian Grove, I'm going to post one to my YouTube. If you want to subscribe, the link is in the bio. Okay, so the Bohemian Grove refers to a secretive members-only retreat that hosts a yearly gathering in the woods of California. This secret society is exclusive to only men and has been in existence since 1872. During the encampment, the events that take place are kept hidden from the public and outside photography is strictly forbidden. However, there have been various photos and videos that have leaked through the years showing unusual gatherings and unexplained rituals. The grounds are protected by a year-round security team and very few outsiders have ever been able to get inside. The mystery of these rituals is one that perplexes the outside world. So why do the richest men of the world partake in the Bohemian Grove? There is no way that you didn't see a trailer for this back in 2019. The Curse of La Llorona was one of the highest grossing horror films of the entire year. The film capitalized on the Latin American legend of the woman who drowned her children and then herself in a fit of rage when she found that her husband was seeing another woman. According to the folklore, she was trapped in a state of purgatory, just doomed to roam the earth as she wept while she would look for children she could steal to replace her own. Although the legend of her ghost is known throughout various parts of Latin America, it is very deeply rooted in Mexican culture, the story often being told to children as a way to encourage them not to wander off in the dark or she'll come for them. Throughout the years, the mystery around this legend has been popularized time and time again, and there are many people who have claimed to see, hear, or even capture her on film. For those who grew up hearing the legend of La Llorona, the fear of seeing her at night is very much real. Also, if you are loving Creep Time, make sure that you subscribe to my YouTube channel with the link in the bio. What's the first thing that you think when looking at these pictures? For anybody who has childhood memories of Televisa and Channel 5, this was part of a nightly broadcast as a PSA to show missing people throughout the late 90s. But this is the photo that caught everyone's attention, Celine Delgado. Audiences noticed there was something kind of off about her. The photo wasn't like the others. It was grainy, it was black and white, and there was seemingly almost no information on her. An inquiry into the public files of Mexico City found that there was no record of a missing woman who was named Celine Delgado. So why was Channel 5 running an image of a woman who wasn't missing? Sleuths Online did a composite cross-comparison where her image was uploaded to a 3D modeling program and proven that it was an amalgamation of other images and that she wasn't a real person. But why? Things remained pretty quiet until that of late 2019 when Channel 5 began posting strange content without explanation. Every night around 3 a.m. there were a series of disturbing video clips that were posted to their public-facing Twitter account and then immediately deleted. But there was one video in particular that reignited the eerie feelings around Delgado. This video, entitled Celine. In it can be seen a distorted compilation of clips around an unknown woman, and then it was deleted immediately after posting. But truthfully, from a rational perspective, I could chalk this story up to any number of explanations. It could be hoaxes, it could be hackings, it could even be marketing. But the really strange part to me is why they would intentionally choose to show an image of a woman who didn't exist, and do so quietly for so many years. This is True Crime by State. Today we are starting with Alabama. I'd completely forgotten this story took place in Alabama at all. It is insane. This is the case of Dr. Amy Bishop. Dr. Bishop was a highly credentialed Harvard graduate who went on to be a biology professor at the University of Alabama. She was known to be standoffish. She had a lot of difficulty socializing with other colleagues in the department. She also had an incredibly dark past. When she was 15, she accidentally shot and killed her brother in their home with a family rifle during an argument. But following that acquittal, let's move forward a good number of years. This is February 12th, 2010. She had just been denied tenure at the university, and this would be her last semester. She was effectively non-renewed. She was fired. So on that February morning, Dr. Bishop teaches 2 classes for biology and then goes to attend a faculty meeting. So everyone is sitting at a conference table, and about 40 minutes into the meeting, she stands up in silence, turns to her side, and fires a 9mm execution style around the room. 3 of those professors are killed instantly, 3 more are wounded, and at some point her gun stalls, which gives them an opportunity to wrestle her, and they get her out of the room and they lock her out. Bishop is apprehended very quickly, and she's in complete denial of what she just did. She doesn't even understand that people are dead. She can't accept it. She was later charged with capital murder and narrowly escaped prosecution for the death penalty under a plea deal. The case of Dr. Bishop has haunted the university for years as to how someone who was capable of such atrocities was seemingly able to fly under the radar as more than just normal, but actually exceptional in academia. This is True Crime by State. Today we are covering Alaska. I went through a lot of cases for Alaska, but there was nothing that compared to Robert Hansen. Outwardly, Robert was a pretty successful person living in Alaska throughout the 70s and 80s. He owned a bakery, he had his own home, he even had a small private plane, and was a pretty accomplished hunter. But Robert had a dark past. He grew up with severe acne and a horrible stutter, and was often the subject of ridicule and rejection from the girls he liked. But in his twisted mind, that rejection bred a lifelong justification for revenge. It was routine for Robert to abduct young women in his car and then bring them home where they were tortured and assaulted. He'd then fly them on his private plane to a remote location to then release and hunt them through the woods as if it was sport. But it all changed with Cindy Paulson. When Cindy was captured, she was tortured and then handcuffed, and then she was brought to board his plane. While he was in and out of the car while loading the cockpit of the plane, she saw her chance. He had left the door unlocked. She kicks off her shoes to leave them in the car as evidence, sneaks out the driver's side, and makes a run for it. She gets away, but when found by police, they start to discredit her accusations because she's a sex worker and he's a well-liked community member, and they don't want to believe her. But she had specific knowledge of the plane and this hunting ritual, which matched an already open investigation, so they approved a search warrant. This uncovered almost all of the evidence they needed to link him to numerous bodies that were found on those hunting grounds. His sentencing would keep him in prison for the rest of his days. But if it hadn't been for Cindy, there's no knowing how long he would have gone on killing. This case is gonna give you chills. Welcome to Creep Time on TikTok with Silas Dean. This story is from a man named Grady Hendrix about his childhood back in the 80s. So his parents had moved into this house around May of 1981. He's like any other 9-year-old kid. He realizes he can sneak downstairs in the middle of the night and grab anything he wants from the kitchen without his parents finding out. Until one night, while he's sneaking down in the dark, he hears something that makes him freeze. The sound of a fork hitting a counter in the kitchen. From the hallway, he can see the outline of a tall, thin man who had been eating at the kitchen counter. He races upstairs and he gets his parents up from their sleep, but of course by the time they go downstairs, there's nothing. But over the next couple of months, there's odd instances of strange noises in the house, there's things being misplaced in the kitchen. Over that summer, while he's lying awake in bed, he hears movements coming from the ceiling above him, so he flips over on his back. He recounts seeing a pair of eyes staring back at him from the ceiling vent. He becomes hysterical. His parents get up, they have to search the attic, they search all the crawl spaces, but still, they're not finding anything. They just keep assuming that he's freaked himself out. But by the end of that summer, an HVAC inspector comes to the house and finds something horrific. The rotting remains of a dead man who had crawled into their vent system and was living in their walls. I can't think of anything more chilling than that, but of course what this meant was that everything Grady had seen was real. Since I've heard this story, I can't look at the vents in my house. I'm so freaked out. Please be careful who your kids are around. Welcome to Creep Time on TikTok with Silas Dean. This is the story of the Demon of Luna Park. Luna Park was a thriving theme park in Australia, even through the late 1970s. It was home to the popular ride known as the Ghost Train. On June 9th of 1979, the Godson family were at the park when a mysterious costumed man approached the family without speaking a word. The mother, Jenny, just assumed that this was a park actor, so she ended up taking this photo of her son Damien standing with the man just before he would join his brother and father riding the Ghost Train that very evening. While the boys are riding, the mother Jenny walks off to go grab a snack, but then returns to find the ride completely engulfed in flames. The Ghost Train had been set on fire with 35 people on the ride at the time. 7 of those riders would never make it off, including her husband and 2 children. At some point much later, Jenny would remember the mysterious costumed man who had approached the family just before the fire broke out. She ends up contacting the park owners to try to inquire about who the man might have been, and to their horror, they explained that they do not employ any costumed actors within the park. For years, police have pleaded with the public, but the man in the mask has never been identified and is largely suspected to be involved with the fire of June 9th. Till this day, he is only known as the Demon of Luna Park. On the morning of January 14th, 1989, something very unusual happened on a Chicago news station. WMAQ, which is an NBC affiliate, interrupted all of their morning programming and ran this Photo: a missing woman named Joanna Lopez. But viewers noticed something very off about this photo. It's completely unrecognizable. It wouldn't make sense to run this to identify anybody. That's also not typically how missing person broadcasts are shown. There's usually descriptors like height or weight, not just a phone number. Home videos caught that this was actually broadcast again in 1991 for 10 seconds before it cut away to color bars. But what's really strange is that a probe into the public records of Chicago showed that there was no woman who was missing by this name. She exists in none of the archives of missing people in 1989 for Chicago, and there is no news record of her with NBC. So who was this missing woman, and why was WMAQ showing her on their broadcast?